So next, it would be great if, do we have Cheludo on the line? Yes, great. Maybe if you could put your video on while I introduce you. So Cheludo Tinaye Butale is currently pursuing a doctoral degree in international relations at Cyprus International University. She is a gender activist at Publicity Secretary of Emang Basadi Women's Association in Botswana, responsible for increasing awareness among women and the public in general about the specific problems faced by women and work towards greater social equality. Her PhD focuses on gender norms from a trade perspective in international organizations that include the European Union, Southern African Development Community, and the Association of Southern East Nations. She has 6 years of experience dealing with issues of public policy at the Ministry of State President in Botswana. And she previously worked at Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Botswana, where she focused on research projects on gender, social justice, and democracy. And Cheludo will be talking to us about the unintended consequences of the FATF's terrorist financing agenda on women's rights organizations in Uganda. So over to you.
Okay, thank you for the lovely introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Sorry for that slight challenge that I was just having connecting, but my presentation is basically on the unintended consequences of FATF on women's rights organizations in Uganda. So the outline is as follows. I'll just briefly go cover the background of the global anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism, and just briefly touch on the FATF. A lot has been said about it, so I'll try to be a bit specific and try to really look at the institutional framework of the FATF to try and see how it is affecting also the implementation of Recommendation 8 at national levels. And we'll also look at the Global NPO Coalition on FATF, which is a civil society organization, group of civil society networks working with the FATF in the implementation of Recommendation 8. Then I will then go down and focus into the situation in Uganda and how Recommendation 8 is implemented. So basically, we'll try to capture, look at the text, the language that is used within Recommendation 8 and the implication it has at national levels, particularly with a focus of Uganda Women Rights Organization, as I had said. Next slide, please. It's normally important to just understand the brief background, how the criminalization of money laundering came about, and we can trace it through to the Vienna Convention and the Palmero Convention. The Vienna Convention of 1988 focused mainly on illicit trafficking of narcotics, amongst others, and then included money laundering. And then the Palmero also focuses on issues of counterterrorism and everything. So that background also laid the foundation for international organizations and counterterrorism bodies such as the FATF, the UNODC, United Nations resolutions focusing on issues of money laundering. And the FATF, as has been indicated, was formed in 1989, and it extends on the functions of the following UNSCR resolutions that I've indicated, 1375 and the Terrorist Financing Convention of the United Nations. It extends on those, it extends or complements those functions. So in a way, it works hand in hand also with other institutions or bodies within the United Nations. Next slide, please. So the background of the FATF, I will not exhaust it. A lot has been said about it. What I can just basically focus on is on the mutual evaluations that are carried out also by the FATF. And with regards to Uganda, the mutual evaluations that focus on compliant, non-compliant ratings of countries. With regards to Uganda, we can see that there has been challenges, especially with regards to the NPO on issues of terrorism financing, in understanding it, and in having the proper legal framework, and also in the engagement of the NPOs or the nonprofit organizations, of which we will discuss in detail later on how it has been affected by it. So we can move to the next slide, because I don't want to exhaust the explanation of what the FATF does. And then within the FATF, we can see that there's also that risk assessment approach that is there or applicable to it. The risk-based approach works whereby it identifies NPOs in high-risk areas where, for instance, terrorist activities occurs and where money laundering or other types of or financial irregularities are common. But then we then question and ask ourselves that is there evidence that within those high-risk areas that the FATF is saying that NPOs could be used for terrorist activities or could be taken advantage of? Has there been a lot of empirical evidence on such issues of linking them to that, of which the case we have seen that still there's not a lot of empirical evidence suggesting that FATF that operates in high-risk areas are also susceptible to be taken advantage of by terrorist activities. Also, we have the issue with the uncertainty associated with the risk-based approach of what constitutes appropriate risk assessments that can be used by national regulators. There's no that clear framework of what really constitutes a risk and what specific model can be used by countries with regards to that, which has then led to gaps or challenges of countries implementing the FATF resolutions. And as we'll see later, it has also led to the unintended consequences on women's rights organizations, resulting in issues of de-risking, lack of financial access, issues of deregistration of various women's rights organizations. Next slide, please. And then within this risk-based approach that has been adopted, that is linked to recommendation 1 of the FATF, as we can see that previously the entire NPOs were regarded as a threat or a risk. But then within the latest recommendation, we see that those NPOs that are likely to pose a risk are the ones that should guide countries in terms of using the risk-based approach. But like I've already indicated, that it still has been a challenge because the risk of NPOs being used for terrorism purposes is not justified by empirical evidence and therefore has encouraged overregulation. So still this risk-based approach that we have has given us challenges at a national level. Okay, next slide. Within the institutional framework, a lot has also been said about the structure of the FATF, but what I can just highlight that we can describe it in terms of a neo-Gramsci approach by Antonio Gramsci, who tries to explain it in terms of hegemony, cohesive consent, in which we see that the FATF continues to have dominant power over other countries, and in terms of the decision-making processes, we see that those that are in charge of the decision-making processes within the ATF mostly come from developed countries. And we can also see that even the MPOs, there's not much inclusion of MPOs from the global south, which then forms a challenge, and then which has also resulted in us describing it in terms of this neo-Gramscian theory, whereby cohesiveness of the FATF, we see it in terms of blacklisting, economic penalties that have been common in various countries. So that's a theory that we can also use to understand that even though it's soft law, the FATF, there's been the hard law applicable in terms of the contents that have been applied within the FTA 40+9 recommendation. Next slide. So basically what we can see that because of that institutional structure of the FATF, of which the measures that have been taken basically focus on security or economic aspects of blacklisting, penalties, de-risking, deregistration, financial surveillance. Those we can describe as short-term goals to addressing long-term issues of terrorism, the root causes of terrorism. It also leaves us with a question of us asking ourselves, is that the way it should be when we address issues of terrorism? Is that the approach we should adopt? And then when we look at the FATF Global Nonprofit Organization Coalition, as I've indicated, that it really works with the FATF to discuss some intended consequences that the FATF policies may have or the FATF standards may have on the NPOs. And then within Uganda, we have the Defenders Protection Initiative working to prevent overregulation of NPOs in Uganda. But it has also experienced the challenges in terms of the legal and regulatory framework in addressing some issues, which has mostly affected women rights organizations, which I'll discuss in a bit. And then we can see that the Global NPO Coalition on FATF has played a major role in terms of the revision of Recommendation 8. But even though it has played a major role in the revision of the Recommendation 8, there is still a gap. There's still a gap in understanding how, or in the way it has been conceptualized, and in understanding certain issues with regards to a risk-based approach. Next slide, please. So as a result of that, we have seen that Recommendation 8, as I'll explain more in the next slide, has led to us asking ourselves that those NPOs that are seen to be at risk or operate in areas that are at risk, then we ask ourselves, like within that definition of risk, what is the potential risk and actual abuse that the FATF tries to unpack, of which it still has remained unclear and resulted in many challenges for us. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So, like I said, Recommendation 8 has had challenges, like I've seen, like I've indicated here. When we look at NPOs could be required to take reasonable measures to document the identity of their significant donors. So what are those reasonable measures? Those are the issues that continue to be unclear, and states have taken advantage of such issues. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Like I've indicated, those ambiguous terms that are not really explained. And then within Uganda, we try to look at the laws in Uganda. I've tried to highlight the background, socio-political, economic context. And with regards to the NPOs, we can see that within Uganda, there are those that are pro-government and those that oppose government. Those that mostly oppose government are those that engage in advocacy work or challenge human rights issues. And those are the ones that various acts like the NGO Act of 2016, the Anti-Terrorism Act has affected them mostly in terms of their operation. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Like I've indicated, the various acts that are in there. And then when we look at the NGO Act in Uganda, it defines NPOs or civil society as those that voluntary associations or individuals involved in service delivery, but leaves out issues of advocacy rights or issues of human rights. Then it also raises questions, and it also leads to the state likely taking advantage of such unclear terminologies that are used within the Act. So then we look at the FATF. The FATF does not include anti-money laundering requirements to issues of countering the financing of terrorism on NPOs, but Uganda uses both of them. So those are the challenges that we also see. Next slide. So within that, we have also seen that even the Anti-Terrorism Act, including the Anti-Terrorism Act, does not also define properly what terrorism is. It describes it as violence, political, with the intent of political, social, cultural, and in an unlawful way. So it sees it as motivated either through political, social, economic ends, but it's unclear on exactly what political, economic, social ends, what are they exactly. So those ambiguous, the ambiguous language used within that text has also created serious implications for women rights organizations. Next slide, please. So I'll just briefly cover the impact that women's rights organizations such as the Ugandan Women Network, among others, have been affected by challenging issues related to human rights or challenging issues of the Constitution, such as the lifting of the age of the presidential age limit. They've been affected in terms of they've been charged with issues of terrorism financing, and this has affected their job in terms of the accounts have been freezed, so they've not been carrying out campaigns such as on gender-based violence, and some of the NGOs, women rights organizations, have not been able to provide shelter for gender-based violence survivors. Next slide, please. We can see that also the NGO Act has also affected the activities of the LGBTI in terms of the financial surveillances and harassment that has been used on the activists, which has also affected their day-to-day activities. So de-risking has been worsened by the FATF that has not incorporated an assessment of de-risking practices into the mutual evaluation reports and how to prevent this problem from restricting the civic space. So within the within the context of Uganda, the concept of the Gramsci theory of hegemony, coercion, and consent can be applicable to show how the state has used its laws, its power, and coercion to affect women rights organizations. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So in general, we can see that the FATF has lacked a human rights approach to it, and it has challenges of human rights oversight and clear accountability and mechanism, and the clear understanding of the language of terrorism and how to deal with it, which has also had a trickle-down effect in countries such as Uganda. And you can see that it has really had an adverse impact on women NGOs. Women NGOs, as we know, they also closely work with the community. However, they tend to be excluded on such issues, but they tend to work on issues of rehabilitation, reintegration when it comes to issues of terrorism and finding long-term solutions, but they continue to be excluded on such issues. And they continue to be excluded on specific NPO risk assessments to be engaged on that. Thank you very much for your time. That ends my presentation.
Thank you very much. It was another very enlightening presentation and great to hear from you.